Hi, I'm Josh, and just when I had firmly resolved to finally start significantly shortening my book reviews, wouldn't you know it, I go ahead and I read just the best book of all time. Well, tied for best of all time. If any of you have been following along with my channel for any length of time, you might know that my very favorite books across all genres, practically my holy scriptures as it were, are these nonfiction books by Kurt Vonnegut Jr., these collections of Kurt Vonnegut's speeches and essays and so forth that have been collected into various publications, starting here with Wampeter's Foment and Grand Falloons, published in 1974, then Palm Sunday in 1981, Fate's Worse Than Death, 1991, and A Man Without a Country from 2005. And the most recent one that I've just read is If This Isn't Nice, What Is?, subtitled The Graduation Speeches and Other Words to Live By, and subtitled The Even More Expanded Third Edition by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The first edition of this book, it looks like, was published in 2013, I think, which was around 5 years after Kurt Vonnegut's death. And then this Even More Expanded Third Edition is from 2020, and it is a collection of, like the subtitle says, mostly graduation speeches made by Kurt Vonnegut from the years 1969 all the way to the early 2000s. So speeches covering over 3 decades and a lot of wisdom in there at the same time. The first thing I'm going to talk about, as I normally do when I talk about books, is the writing. And one thing that's quite interesting about Kurt Vonnegut's writing style is that it is very, very simple prose, almost to the point of being simplistic, but not, that sounds almost too negative. It is very straightforward, to the point, but it also has little sprinklings of almost absurdist humor spread throughout the speeches at the same time. So it is a very easy read, especially since all the speeches themselves are quite short and the print in the book is nice and big. So it makes for very easy reading. And I like what is said in the introduction, which was written by somebody named Dan Wakefield, who I'm not familiar with, but he said that Kurt was playful at the same time as he was profound. And so, like I said, there's this mix of this fun, playful humor with really profound ideas, all presented in a very simple, straightforward manner. And that sort of led me to this idea that Kurt's writing in all of these books is playful profundity, is how I like to call it now after reading that. And Vonnegut did have a purpose with his writing. As these are graduation speeches, obviously he's speaking to a crowd of young folks that are just graduating from colleges, universities, presumably in their early 20s. And so he is dealing to young adults moving into the world. And he had this message in mind, not just for the people who were there listening to his speeches, but to the readers of his fiction as well, all the great fiction he wrote. And the idea that he's trying to speak to a younger generation and kind of help them make sense of a mad world as much as it can be understood. And in his own words, Vonnegut says, actually, I'm not even sure what my message as a novelist is, but I would like to infect people with humane ideas before they're able to defend themselves. In other words, before they get older and get other things into their heads, he wants to infect them with humane ideas. There were also a couple of points in his speeches where he refers to his writing process or his writing style, which I thought was super interesting. And he refers to his very simple writing style here. He says, still, being a journalist influenced me as a novelist. I mean, a lot of critics think I'm stupid because my sentences are so simple and my method is so direct. They think these are defects. No. The point is to write as much as you know as quickly as possible. In journalism, you learn to write a story so someone can cut it without even reading it, putting all the most important stuff in the beginning. And in my books, for the first few pages, I say what the hell is going to happen. When I taught at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, I told my students, look, I want you to write in such a way that should you drop dead, the reader ought to be able to finish the story for you. So that's interesting to me that Vonnegut commented on his simple prose and how some people look down on it as being simplistic and stupid. But this other point that he mentions I thought was even more interesting, because to be totally transparent, I've only read one of his fiction books. I read Slaughterhouse-Five, and I didn't really like it all that much. I don't know if it's because I had read all of his other nonfiction works and just really enjoyed the plain, straightforward messages he was presenting there, as opposed to the way he was writing them in more allegorical fashion in Slaughterhouse-Five. It didn't hit me in quite the same way reading it in his fiction format. So I would actually like to try some of his other books like Cat's Cradle, and I have a couple others on the shelf there too. So I was really intrigued when I read this little bit here. When my father was dying, he said, quote, "I want to thank you because you've never put a villain in any of your stories," unquote. The secret ingredient in my books is there has never been a villain. Some cultures we studied at Chicago were quite gruesome, because he actually studied to be an anthropologist at one point. The Aztecs were really scary, cutting people's hearts out. The Mayans weren't much better, and there have been instances of terrible cruelty even in benign societies living in peace. Society can be a villain, just the way a mother can be, which is referring to something he was previously talking about. But I thought, that's fascinating. Is that true that in all his fiction books there isn't a villain? What an interesting way to write a story, and very counterintuitive to a lot of other sci-fi books that might sit in the same genre as Vonnegut's fictional works. But I thought that was super interesting. Now, broadening out from writing to art in general, Vonnegut has some really cool things to say about art and artists. And right from the very beginning here in the introduction, we have, again, that fellow who wrote the intro saying this about what Vonnegut said. And he says, Vonnegut had written that the function of the artist is to make people like life better than before. And when asked if he'd ever seen that done, he answered, yes, the Beatles did it. Carrying that idea forward a bit, Vonnegut says in another speech, a teacher asked me one time, what is it artists do? And I mumbled something, and then his teacher went on to say, they do two things, he said. First, they admit they can't straighten out the whole universe. And then second, they make at least one little part of it exactly as it should be. A blob of clay, a square of canvas, a piece of paper, or whatever. But art isn't just good for the world at large, it's also good for the artist. Vonnegut says, practicing an art, no matter how well or badly, is a way to make your soul grow, for heaven's sake. Sing in the shower, dance to the radio, tell stories. And then Vonnegut contrasts art with military action and says, the arts put man at the center of the universe, whether he belongs there or not. Military science, on the other hand, treats man as garbage, and his children, and his cities too. Military science is probably right about the contemptibility of man in the vastness of the universe. Still, I deny that contemptibility, and I beg you to deny it through the creation of appreciation of art. And then this final word of advice for Vonnegut regarding art. Write a poem to a friend, even a lousy poem. Do it as well as you possibly can. You will get an enormous reward. You will have created something. And unfortunately, where there's art, there's also censorship. And I was interested to read that censorship was a big problem for Vonnegut and a bunch of his books back in the, I don't know what, it would have been the 60s or 70s thereabouts. And schools were banning some of his books, and they were saying that there was bad language in the books. And Vonnegut's response to this was the following. If you were to bother to read my books, to behave as educated persons would, you would learn that they are not sexy and do not argue in favor of wildness of any kind. They beg that people be kinder and more responsible than they often are. It is true that some of the characters speak coarsely. That is because people speak coarsely in real life. Especially soldiers and hard-working men speak coarsely, and even our most sheltered children know that. And we all know, too, that those words really don't damage children much. They didn't damage us when we were young. It was evil deeds and lying that hurt us. In another speech later, Kurt says this, so it is not too much to ask of Americans that they not be censors, that they run the risk of being deeply wounded by ideas so that we may all be free. If we are wounded by an ugly idea, we must count it as part of the cost of freedom and, like American heroes in the days gone by, bravely carry on. And that's a great thought, that with free speech, you're going to hear ideas that offend you, but it is worth being offended if we have free speech, for sure. Now, setting aside art and writing and all that stuff, let's get to the title of this book, which again is, If This Isn't Nice, What Is? And the origin story of this phrase is quite interesting and quite a good lesson for us as well. But about my Uncle Alex, who is up in heaven now, which is one of Vonnegut's favorite jokes as an atheist, is saying that dead people were up in heaven now. But anyways, about his Uncle Alex. One of the things he found objectionable about human beings was that they so rarely noticed it when they were happy. He himself did his best to acknowledge it when times were sweet. We could be drinking lemonade in the shade of an apple tree in the summertime, and Uncle Alex would interrupt the conversation to say, "If this isn't nice, what is?" So I hope that you will do the same for the rest of your lives. When things are going sweetly and peacefully, please pause a moment and then say out loud, "If this isn't nice, what is?" Later he says, "Uncle Alex thought it was a terrible waste to be happy and not notice it. So do I." And it just encompasses so much about mindset and just being in the moment, noticing the things around you, appreciating the little things that are going well for you, which is so easy to miss if we're buried in our phones or distracted by life in general, I think. So that's pretty cool. Now, one topic that appeared important to Vonnegut, based on the fact that he came back to it a few times in different speeches, was the idea of loneliness and community. Even in the years before social media exploded, when the main forms of entertainment were television and the early internet, there was really an epidemic of loneliness as noticed by Vonnegut, and he had some ideas about that. And I think that's interesting, given that this whole, I think, epidemic has gotten even so much worse due to so-called social media, which is really a bit of a misnomer. It's almost the opposite of that, is it? It's like anti-social media even. But this idea of loneliness within our current lives and the way they are structured. And here's what Vonnegut has to say about it. What should young people do with their lives today? Many things, obviously, but the most daring thing is to create stable communities in which the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured. And then later on, he gets into more specifics when he says, "We are so lonely because we don't have enough friends and relatives. Human beings are supposed to live in stable, like-minded, extended families of 50 people or more. Your class spokesperson mourned the collapse of the institution of marriage in this country. Marriage is collapsing because our families are too small. A man cannot be a whole society to a woman, and a woman cannot be a whole society to a man. We try, but it is scarcely surprising that so many of us go to pieces. So I recommend that everybody here join all sorts of organizations, no matter how ridiculous, simply to get more people in his or her life. It does not matter much if all the other members are morons. Quantities of relatives of any sort are what we need." Carrying this idea on a bit further here. "Let's find a way to get ourselves and others extended families again. A husband and a wife and some kids aren't a family any more than a Diet Pepsi and 3 Oreos is a breakfast. 20, 30, 40 people, that's a family. Marriages are all busting up. Why? Mates are saying to each other, because they're human, 'You're not enough people for me.'" And I love this point, because when you look at it, throughout the entirety of human history on this planet, almost all of the time was spent as hunter-gatherers in small groups of fewer than 200 people largely, who were mutually supporting each other, working together as communities and families, and just trying to survive and do life together. And modern life has split us asunder and put us each in our own individual houses in these great cities that have separated us through various means, through physical distance, through busyness, through the internet and social media and all that stuff. And that is really the heart of this epidemic of loneliness that I think Vonnegut has really hit on. With these thoughts in mind, naturally Vonnegut was very much against the things within our society that divide us, that set us and factionalize us against each other, that split this idea of community. And in a similar manner, Vonnegut had a similar disdain for generational divides, these so-called Generation X, Y, Z, Generation Alpha, whatever you want to call it. And so, I mean, Vonnegut's point here that he's going to make is that human life is that short. We all just got here. Like, to separate us by generations is kind of silly. And so here's how he says it. Again, talking to graduating students who are about to go out into the world. Life is going to be very tough again just as soon as this is over. And the most useful thought we can hold when all hell cuts loose again is that we are not members of different generations, as unlike, as some people would have us believe, as Eskimos and Australian Aborigines. We are all so close to each other in time that we should think of ourselves as brothers and sisters. I have several children, 7 to be exact. Too many children for an atheist, certainly. Whenever my children complain about the planet to me, I say, "Shut up! I just got here myself. Who do you think I am, Methuselah? You think I like the news of the day any better than you do? You're wrong. We are all experiencing more or less the same lifetime now." And then in a later speech, and this ties back to, again, what he was saying about communities, "I apologize because of the terrible mess the planet is in, but it has always been a mess. There have never been any good old days. There have just been days. And as I say to my grandchildren, don't look at me. I just got here myself. So you know what I'm going to do? I declare everybody here a member of Generation A. Tomorrow is another day for all of us. Having said that, I've made us, for a few hours at least, what most of us do not have and what we need so desperately. I've made us an extended family, one for all and all for one. A husband, a wife, and some kids is not a family. It's a terribly vulnerable survival unit. Now, those of you who get married or are married, when you fight with your spouse, what each of you will be saying to the other one actually is, "You're not enough people. You're only one person. I should have hundreds of people around." And one thing that definitely divides and stratifies us is wealth. So Vonnegut was very much in favor of any sort of societal social supports. And he thus had wealthy people confront him on this. And this is what he says. "Well-dressed people ask me sometimes, with their teeth bared as though they were about to bite me, if I believe in a redistribution of wealth. I can only reply that it doesn't matter what I think, that wealth is already being redistributed every hour, often in ways that are absolutely fantastic." And isn't that true? The wealth is being redistributed this way. And so, carrying on with that idea, Kurt asks sarcastically, "Doesn't anything socialist make you want to throw up, like great public schools or health insurance for all?" I like how he summed up his own politics here. "My politics in a nutshell. Let's stop giving corporations and newfangled contraptions what they need and get back to giving human beings what we need." And the final point on the topic of wealth comes from a conversation he had with an author that I like a lot as well, called Joseph Heller, who wrote what is probably my number one favorite fictional work of all time, that being Catch-22. And so Vonnegut describes this meeting he had with Joseph Heller at a party and says, "We were at a party thrown by a multi-billionaire out on Long Island, and I said, 'Joe, how does it make you feel to realize that only yesterday our host probably made more money than Catch-22, one of the most popular books of all time, has grossed worldwide over the past 40 years? Joe said to me, "I have something he can never have." I said, "What's that, Joe?" And he said, "The knowledge that I've got enough." If that isn't nice, what is? The knowledge that you've got enough, that you don't need more. The natural contentment that comes with having your basic needs met and understanding that more stuff isn't going to make things better. So what's another thing that divides us from each other and splits apart our communities? Well, I mentioned it previously when I mentioned the idea of media with television and computers and that sort of thing. And so Kurt had this to say about technology. "It has been said many times that man's knowledge of himself has been left far behind by his understanding of technology, and that we can have peace and plenty and justice only when man's knowledge of himself catches up. This is not true. Some people hope for great discoveries in the social sciences, social equivalents of F equals ma and E equals mc squared and so on. Others think we have to evolve to become better monkeys with bigger brains. We don't need more information. We don't need bigger brains. All that is required is that we become less selfish than we are. We already have plenty of sound suggestions as to how we are to act if things are to become better on Earth. For instance, do unto others as you would have them do unto you." This next point was particularly poignant to me in light of this whole AI thing that is taking over our technology, or at least attempting to, but will probably ultimately fail at it. But anyways, Vonnegut says, I hope you know that television and computers are no more your friends and no more your increasers of your brain power than slot machines. All they want is for you to sit still and buy all kinds of junk and play the stock market as though it were a game of blackjack. And only well-informed, warm-hearted people can teach others things they'll always remember and love. Computers and TV don't do that. A computer teaches a child what a computer can become. An educated human being teaches a child what a child can become. What an amazing point in today's climate. A computer can teach you what a computer can become, but only a human can teach you how to be a human. So naturally, Vonnegut was a fan of books, as an author, that goes without saying, I guess, but he says, some of you will become mothers. I don't recommend it, but these things happen. If that should fall to your lot, you may find compensation in these words by the poet William Ross Wallace. The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And keep that kid the hell away from computers and TV sets, unless you want it to become a lonesome imbecile who steals money from your purse so it can buy stuff. Don't give up on books. They feel so good. Their friendly heft, the sweet reluctance of their pages when you turn them with your sensitive fingertips. A large part of our brain is devoted to deciding whether what our hands are touching is good or bad for us. Any brain worth a nickel knows books are good for us. And don't try to make yourself an extended family out of ghosts on the internet. Get yourself a Harley and join the Hells Angels instead. Again, that absurdist humor that actually has a decent point to it. In other words, get together with humans, get involved with people and human organizations. So this final point about technology and how it separates us. Bertrand Russell declared that in case he met God, he would say to him, "Sir, you did not give us enough information." I would add to that, "All the same, sir, I'm not persuaded that we did the best we could with the information we had. Toward the end there, anyway, we had tons of information." Our most dismaying failure is in the use of our knowledge of what human beings need in the way of bodily and spiritual nourishment. And I suspect that some of the guesses made by our ancestors are partly responsible for the starved bodies and spirits we see everywhere. Shame on us. Less shame on our ancestors. What we need for bodily and spiritual nourishment certainly isn't more time online. Hey, thanks for being online and watching my video. Appreciate it. Also super appreciate my Patreon supporters, especially my highest tier supporters, Joanna, Abo, Osmandas Perfect. Your support for me means the world to me. Like I previously mentioned, Vonnegut was an atheist, and so he did have some issues with organized religion as it exists, and yet he did very much appreciate the teachings of Jesus. Specifically, he says, how about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And so on. Not exactly planks in a Republican platform. For some reason, the most vocal Christians among us never mention the Beatitudes, but often with tears in their eyes, they demand that the 10 Commandments be posted in public buildings. And of course, that's Moses, not Jesus. I haven't heard one of them demand that the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, be posted anywhere. Blessed are the merciful in a courtroom? Blessed are the peacemakers in the Pentagon? Give me a break. I also like what he had to say about what a saint truly is. He says, but hey, listen, I got a letter from a sappy woman a while back. She knew I was sappy too, a Franklin Roosevelt Democrat, a friend of the working stiffs. She was about to have a baby. Not mine. She wanted to know if it was a mistake to bring an innocent little baby into a world as awful as this one is. I told her that what made life almost worth living for me was the saints I met. These were people who behaved compassionately and capably, no matter what, and they could be anywhere. So maybe some of you tonight are or may become saints for her child to meet. Most of us are loaded with original sin, but a surprising number of us, not me, God knows, are loaded with original virtue. Ain't that sweet? That is sweet. One of my big issues with Christianity is this idea of original sin, that we are born into sin, that we are born deserving of death, that we are just wretched sinners, and that's who we are naturally. But this idea of original virtue, that we can be virtuous people, we can behave compassionately without external forces prodding us to do so. And then finally, I enjoyed Vonnegut's prayer here, especially how he addresses God. You want to know what I pray every night? I go down on my old knees next to my cot in the coal bin, and I pray with all my heart. To whom it may concern. Couldn't you please put my soul inside a sea otter or a barn owl instead? I would rather be a sea otter than a human being, even if there were another oil spill. To whom it may concern. All right, what's another big thing that separates us from community, that pits us one against the other? And that is, of course, war and violent conflict. And just for Vonnegut's background, he did serve as an infantryman in the Second World War. He was actually a scout and got captured by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, was sent to Germany as a prisoner of war, was locked up in a slaughterhouse, which is where his book Slaughterhouse-Five comes from. And while him and some other Allied prisoners were locked up inside the slaughterhouse just outside of a town called Dresden, the Allies sent the bombers to absolutely obliterate this civilian city with firebombs. And so following that firebombing of Dresden by the good guys in the war, the Allied prisoners of war, including Vonnegut, were made then to go out into the city to dig through the rubble of the firebombed city and dig out all the corpses of the civilians that had been killed in that attack. And so that was Vonnegut's Second World War experience. That's what prompted, like I said, his book Slaughterhouse-Five, and really, really shaped the way he thought about life and humanity in general. And so here's what Vonnegut has to say on this topic. And this is probably the longest quote of the video, but I think it's worth reading. I am so smart, I know what is wrong with the world. Everybody asks during and after our wars and the continuing terrorist attacks all over the globe, what's gone wrong? What has gone wrong is that too many people, including high school kids and heads of state, are obeying the Code of Hammurabi, a king of Babylonia who lived nearly 4,000 years ago. And you can find his code echoed in the Old Testament too. Are you ready for this? An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. A categorical imperative for all who live in obedience to the Code of Hammurabi, which includes heroes of every cowboy show and gangster show that you ever saw, is this. Every injury, real or imagined, shall be avenged. Somebody's going to be really sorry. Bombs away, or whatever. When Jesus Christ was nailed to a cross, he said, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." What kind of a man was that? Any real man obeying the Code of Hammurabi would have said, "Kill them, Dad, and all their friends and relatives, and make their deaths slow and painful." His greatest legacy to us, in my humble opinion, consists of only 12 words. They are the antidote to the poison of the Code of Hammurabi, a formula almost as compact as Albert Einstein's E equals mc squared. Jesus of Nazareth told us to say these 12 words when we prayed. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Bye-bye, Code of Hammurabi. And for those words alone, he deserves to be called the Prince of Peace. Every act of war, every act of violence, even by a paranoid schizophrenic, celebrates Hammurabi and shows contempt for Jesus Christ. Is anybody here a Presbyterian? I want to warn you, many people have been burned alive in public for believing what you believe, so watch your backs after you get out of here. Some of you may know that I am a humanist, or a free thinker, as were my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and so not a Christian. By being a humanist, I am honoring my mother and father, which the Bible tells us is a good thing to do. But I say with all my American ancestors, if what Jesus said was good and so much of it was absolutely beautiful, what does it matter if he was God or not? If Christ hadn't delivered the Sermon on the Mount with its message of mercy and pity, I wouldn't want to be a human being. I would just as soon be a rattlesnake. Revenge provokes revenge, which provokes revenge, which provokes revenge, forming an unbroken chain of death and destruction, linking nations of today to barbarous tribes of thousands and thousands of years ago. We may never dissuade our leaders of our nation or any other nation from responding vengefully, violently to every insult or injury. In this, the age of television, they will continue to find irresistible the temptation to become entertainers, to compete with movies by blowing up bridges and police stations and factories and so on. Fires, explosions, come look, oh my gosh, hey wow. To quote the late Irving Berlin, there's no business like show business. But in our personal lives, in our inner lives at least, we can learn to live without the sick excitement, without the kick of having scores to settle with this particular person or that bunch of people or that particular institution or race or nation. And we can then reasonably ask forgiveness for our trespasses, since we forgive those who trespass against us. And we can teach our children and then our grandchildren to do the same so that they too can never be a threat to anyone. Okay? Amen. Isn't that wonderful? let's not stop there. He also says, let the killing stop. We live in rural communities and are consequently privileged to see acts of unselfishness and bravery almost every day. I am speaking of our volunteer firemen and our rescue squads. The moment the siren blows, they come. They live in the tradition of the American Minutemen, and God bless them for that. In the past, Americans have proudly responded almost as quickly to calls of war. This is properly called patriotism. Some Americans believe that this is the only form of patriotism. What does the patriot do? He goes to war. This is nuts. There are all kinds of things a patriot can do. We're here with the patriotic purpose of saving lives. If this is treason, make the most of it. And what I've always said is my definition of a patriot is somebody who doesn't study history. A similar thing that Vonnegut thought was nuts was the idea that sending a boy to war will make him a man. He said, and obviously something that he has had very much first-hand experience with, and he says, another event in the lives of American and European males which might be considered a puberty ceremony is war. If a male comes home from a war, especially with serious wounds, everybody agrees, here indeed is a man. When I came home to Indianapolis from the Second World War in Germany, an uncle of mine said to me, by golly, you look like a man now. I wanted to strangle him. If I had, he would have been the first German I'd killed. I was a man before I went to war, but he was damned if he would say so. Now, he does go on to say that there is such a thing as just wars, and he admitted that the war that he was a part of, the Second World War, was one such example of a just war. But he also makes it clear through with his writing that the lines between the good and the bad in a war get very blurry a lot of the time. And while war does split community and human from human, here's what it does do, he says. During our catastrophically idiotic war in Vietnam, order couldn't be restored in Indochina until the locals could finally kick us the hell out of there. That war only made billionaires out of millionaires. This war, speaking of the first Iraq war, is making trillionaires out of billionaires. I call that progress. That slightly absurdist humor again. And so I like his suggestion here. I demand that the administration of Bennington College establish an ROTC unit here. ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Corps, I think. It is imperative that we learn more about military men, since they have so much of our money and power now. It is a great mistake to drive military men from college campuses and into ghettos like Fort Benning and Fort Bragg. Make them do what they do so proudly in the midst of men and women who are educated. Now, I don't agree with 100% of the things that Vonnegut says, and he is a little bit anti-science because, again, with his experience of the war and seeing how scientific advancement really helps people kill each other so effectively, especially with the nuclear bomb towards the end of the war there, or nuclear bombs, I should say. And so he says, I used to think that science would save us, and science certainly tried, but we can't stand any more tremendous explosions, either for or against democracy. That part I agree with, but yeah, I have probably a slightly more positive outlook on science than he does. Here's an interesting point on what prompts civilians to support a government that wants to go to war. I come to a close now by noting that the press, whose business it is to know and understand everything, often find young people to be apathetic, especially when pundits and commentators can't think of anything else to write about or talk about. The new generation of graduates has failed to eat a certain vitamin or mineral, perhaps, iron, perhaps. They have tried blood. They need Geritol. Well, as a member of a zippier generation with a sparkle in its eyes and a snap in its stride, let me tell you what kept us as high as kites a lot of the time. Hatred. All my life I've had people to hate, from Hitler to Nixon. Not that those two are at all comparable in their villainy. It is a tragedy, perhaps, that human beings can get so much energy and enthusiasm from hate. If you want to feel 10 feet tall and as though you could run 100 miles without stopping, hate beats pure cocaine any day. Hitler resurrected a beaten, bankrupt, half-starved nation with hatred and nothing more. Imagine that. So it seems quite likely to me that young people of today in the United States of America are not, in fact, apathetic, but only look that way to people who are used to getting their ecstasies from hatred, among other things, of course. The members of your graduating class are not sleepy, are not listless, are not apathetic. They are simply performing the experiment of doing without hate. Hate is the missing vitamin or mineral or whatever in their diet. They have sensed correctly that hate in the long run is about as nourishing as cyanide. This is a very exciting thing they are doing, and I wish them well. And look online if you want to get attention and popularity and engagement. Say things that will make people angry, that will generate hatred, and my goodness, that will energize people and get them to do things for you. And so let's close with this on this topic of war. Our history teaches us that we need not fear pacifism. It will not leave our nation defenseless. I was raised to be a pacifist, and so were most of people my age. In the public schools of Indianapolis and in the public schools of all over the land, people my age were instructed when young to jeer at the nations of Europe for maintaining enormous standing armies, for wasting their substance on weapons and allowing generals and admirals to help decide what the nations would do next, where the energy and the money and people would go. I learned my contempt for the military at the same place I learned to fear germ-laden strangers and symptoms of homosexuality and so on in the public schools. Every cloud has a silver lining, as they say. Well, all those yellow-bellied pacifists produced by the American public school system in the 1930s became a harrowingly effective army in the early 40s when we got into a war which seemed just. As for preparing this country against an attack from anti-missiles, by developing an anti-missile, I may be in the minority, but I think the American people should spend the money on hospitals and housing and schools and Ferris wheels instead. It's funny to think of Americans as sneering at Europe for being so warlike and centered on military might. Now, one last point that is particularly interesting to me, which I'll get to before I wrap up with Kurt Vonnegut's answers to life in general, is this idea of a board game. As you probably know, I am very much a board game hobbyist, and one thing that Vonnegut tried his hand at before he really took off and became very successful as an author was as a board game designer. So first of all, we have this in the introduction. Actually, it's only really mentioned in the introduction here, but I have some further interesting points to add to that. And so again, the writer of the introduction here is talking about Vonnegut's younger years before he achieved fame and fortune at the age of 47, when he was just trying to support his very large family of his own children and his adopted children. And so the writer says, the popular weekly magazine of the 50s, whose payments for his short stories enabled Vonnegut to leave his job at General Electric, died off with the advent of television, and he had to scramble to make a living. He failed to sell a shirt company on his idea for a new kind of bow tie, had no success creating a new board game, opened a dealership for Saab automobiles when they were just as yet little known in this country, and when that failed, commuted to Boston to write for an ad agency. So this little board game note is quite interesting because it has only recently come to light the specifics of this game, and it came about because, and again, this is information that I found out through their website BoardGameGeek. Somebody was talking about how the notes for this board game had been discovered amongst a bunch of his other notes in some library somewhere, amongst other documents and so forth that were in storage there. And then they had tried to get hold of that to look at the rules of the game and see the specifics of it, but failed to be able to do so. Eventually, another more famous game designer came along and was able to actually get hold of the components for this game, the full rules for them, and so this game designer was able to take Kurt Vonnegut's board game and finally get it actually published. And so this game is out there. The game is called GHQ, which was short for General Headquarters, and here's how it's described on the BoardGameGeek website. World War II veteran Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, was published in 1954. While it was critically well received and reprinted in 1955, it was not a financial success. As he worked on his next novel, which would eventually become Cat's Cradle, he needed to supplement his income with other endeavors. One of those efforts was an original board game called GHQ, or General Headquarters. He designed it throughout 1956 and attempted to sell it to game companies, an effort that was ultimately unsuccessful successful. His notes on the game were filed away and Vonnegut's GHQ was lost to us until now. GHQ is a fast and strategic two-player battle game. Played on a standard 8x8 checkerboard, players command infantry, armored vehicles, artillery, and the powerful airborne regiment, maneuvering to capture the opposing headquarters. Can you skillfully use real-world combined arms tactics and call on reinforcements at the right time to turn the tide of battle? So it was essentially like a World War II themed chess, where each of the military pieces had their own capabilities. Obviously, Vonnegut used his own experience as a soldier in the Second World War to design his game and make it both simple and approachable rules-wise and an somewhat accurate representation of the military conflicts and combined arms. And here's a little quote that came out of Vonnegut's letter to the game publisher that he was trying to sell the game to, and Vonnegut said, "I have played the game about 1,000 times and it works like a dollar watch. The bugs are out of the rules. It is similar in mood to chess and is played on a standard checkerboard. It has enough dignity and interest, I think, to become the third popular checkerboard game. The counters represent artillery, infantry, armored and airborne units, and textbook tactical situations develop on the board. Because of unique features of these rules, these situations and their solutions are amazingly realistic." And it's kind of funny and kind of quaint to think that Vonnegut saw this as the next big game alongside chess and checkers in human history, one that would take over the world, I guess, to a similar extent. And you know, when you see people pop up on a website like BoardGameGeek who don't have a lot of experience with modern board gaming or board game design, they come with their grand ideas and similar aspirations, I think, and the real world, as always, is much more difficult than it at first appears. But this is just an interesting aside because it was an overlap, obviously, with one of my other main hobbies, and I found it quite interesting. Now, to wrap up, within this book, as within these other 4 books, are the answers to life itself. So, you ready for it? Well, there are a couple of answers. Here's the first one. I am enchanted by the Sermon on the Mount. Being merciful, it seems to me, is the only good idea we have received so far. Perhaps we will get another good idea by and by, and then we will have 2 good ideas. From another of his quotes, a purpose of human life, no matter who is controlling it, is to love whoever is around to be loved. And one of Kurt Vonnegut's sons backs him up on this. He was talking about how his son, Mark, had a mental breakdown, was actually in a mental institution for a while, but then later recovered and went on to become a successful doctor. And so this is what Vonnegut says. I put my big question about life to my biological son, Mark. Mark is a pediatrician and author of a memoir entitled The Eden Express. It is about his crack-up, straitjacket, and padded cell stuff from which he recovered sufficiently to graduate from Harvard Medical School. Dr. Vonnegut said this to his doddering old dad. Father, we are here to help each other get through this thing, whatever it is. So I pass that on to you. Write it down and put it in your computer so you can forget it. We are here to help each other get through this thing, whatever it is. And that's why we need community. Going back to Vonnegut's quotes, there is only one rule that I know of, babies. God damn it, you've got to be kind. And then to wrap it up, finally, thanks for sticking with me if you're still here. Really do appreciate it. Kurt says to the entire graduating class that he's speaking to, I give you my word of honor that we love you and need you. We love you simply because you are of our species. You have been born. That is enough. Isn't that wonderful? You are a human, therefore you are worthy of love, respect, kindness. Doesn't matter what race you are, what religion you follow or don't follow, what country you happen to live in, none of that matters. You are human, so you are worthy of love, so we love you. Now let's get to my rating here. This is easy, it's 10 out of 10. Just like all these other 4 books are 10 out of 10. I mean, I just spent a long time showing why it's such a great book. Nothing else to say about that. But isn't it wonderful that I can sit here and share with you all these really wonderful ideas from this really wonderful human that lived not that long ago, that no matter where you are in the world, you can sit here and spend this time with me and even get into the comments and carry on the conversation with me. If this isn't nice, what is? Hi. But for the most part, and unfortunately, unfortunately, where you have art, you also have censorship. And I was interested to hear that a Franklin, and they could be anywhere. Am I reading the right thing? Oh my God, no. Social societal supports. This next point was particularly. This next point was. And don't try to make yourself an extended family out of ghosts on the it. Did I just whistle when I said that? And don't try to make yourself an extended family out of ghosts on the it. That being said, he did have quite a. Yeah, I like these. Not that those two are at all compatible. Hate is the missing vitamin or mineral on the BoardGameGeek web.